Hi, I'm Lance Cottrell, Chief Scientist at Ntrepid, and this is the Ntrepid Cast. Picture this. You've been spending months getting access to a dark web closed group. You're on the site, you have credentials, you've got your account, you're making real progress in your investigation, when suddenly one of the admins kicks you out. He spotted you as a rat and banned you for life, and all of your work is for nothing, and you've got to start from scratch. What could have happened? This is a dark web site. You're supposed to be anonymous, right? How did they identify you? A lot of investigators these days are talking about the dark web and all the things that are going on in that area. And when I say the dark web, what I mean is websites that are hosted through Tor hidden services. So there's no way to directly tell where that website is and who's operating it. The website sits behind a series of Tor relays and is accessed through a special URL. So you can tell if it's a dark website because you see the .onion at the end of the URL, at the end of the host name. And you access these through Tor yourself. So you're always using the Tor anonymity system at both ends whenever you're accessing one of these sites. And there's a lot of activity going on these sites. There's all sorts of marketplaces that buy and sell everything from drugs to weapons to criminal activity, credit card numbers, personal information, you name it, there's that kind of illegal activity going on in these sites. Now, because it's running on Tor, a lot of people assume that automatically means they're anonymous when they're accessing these websites. And in fact, at a superficial level, you are. But there's a lot of ways you can still be exposed, and it's important to pay close attention to them, given the amount of effort it can take to gain access to some of these sites. Now, the people running these dark web sites, these online dark marketplaces, have a lot of reasons to potentially be wanting to identify their visitors. Right? The first off is they want to stop you in all likelihood. They want to detect and block any law enforcement, attorneys, regulators, investigators of any sort from being able to access their online marketplace. They want to be able to do what they want to do in peace and in private. After all, that's kind of the whole point. But they may also want to keep track of their users. After all, the people who are coming to their website are not necessarily upstanding citizens. They're there for their own nefarious purposes. They're often criminals. They're buying or selling illegal goods and services. Well, if the operator of the website can work out who they really are, that gives him some really good leverage that he could potentially use against them. If they ever try to turn on him, if he needs to be able to get some advantage over them, knowing who they are can be really useful. So there's every chance that savvy operators of these sites are going to be making significant effort in trying to identify their users. Now, for years, there have been a number of known technical attacks against the Tor network and other networks known as low latency anonymity networks. So things that allow for real-time communications, loading web pages, things like that. Networks that are not real-time and low latency, like email forwarding networks, are less vulnerable to these kind of attacks, but also much less useful. People want to use the web. The way these attacks typically work is you are introducing some sort of a signal at one end of the chain of data going through the Tor network and looking for it at the other end. So most commonly, if you could control both the first node, the node that the user is connecting to, and the exit node, the one that's going off to the destination, you could have one of them inject a pattern into the traffic and then see if it's on the other one. And if you're lucky enough that the user happens to be using both of the nodes you control, or two of the nodes that you control, if you control a lot of them, then you can very likely identify them. Now, unfortunately for the attacker, the odds of this working are not very high because there are so many thousands and thousands of nodes. It requires taking over a very large fraction of the network before the odds of a user at the same moment they're visiting your site using both the entry and exit nodes. But it changes a little bit if you're running a dark web site, because now you're always interested in trying to affect someone visiting your site So really the only thing you need to get them to do is access one of your guard nodes, one of the entry points into the Tor network. So it's far more likely to be able to get someone by chance using one of your nodes than multiple. And if they're a regular user of the service, as you're likely to be if you're an investigator, the odds multiply all the time. And so if the website, when it's responding to your requests, introduces patterns of activity into the messages they're sending back, it then is much easier for them to recognize that at the gateway node and then see who you are. So if you're just going directly to the Tor network from your desktop and visiting one of these sites, they actually have a pretty decent chance of completely unmasking you. So the first bit of advice is always use an additional level of obfuscation when you're accessing the Tor network. Use another VPN service to give you standoff so that when they track back that IP address, it isn't yours. So make sure you're using some kind of an anonymous IP address, or indeed a misattributed IP address if you want to look even more realistic, rather than your own real IP. Now the main currency on these sites is Bitcoin. A lot of the buying and selling of the credit cards, of the child porn, of the drugs is all done by Bitcoin, because obviously people don't want to use normal currency, they don't want to use bank accounts, they don't want things that are trackable. And in their mind, Bitcoin is not trackable. And that's an interesting mistake for them to make, because in fact, Bitcoin is absolutely tracked. Every single transaction that's ever been made on Bitcoin is stored in the blockchain. And that blockchain is completely public. So anyone can go in and look at every single transaction. Now, it's somewhat anonymous because those transactions are all between wallet numbers. They don't have any real names attached. But as soon as one of those coins is either withdrawn from an entity, one of the Bitcoin exchanges, or spent somewhere that needs to deposit them to get cash or some sort of good, right? If someone actually wants to use the Bitcoin at the end of the day, that's a transaction that's identifiable, and now you can start tracking it back. Who bought it, who sold it, what was done. And so if you're buying and selling things on an exchange and you're not very careful about how you acquire your Bitcoins, you may be very vulnerable to just this kind of attack. For example, if your office purchases a block of Bitcoin to use in various operations, and then anonymously you're splitting that up into other wallets and spending it individually on different transactions under different aliases, you're actually tying all of those together. Every single one of those investigations can be easily traced back to the source wallet and therefore tied to each other. So they can now know anytime they see one of those coins show up, it's because one of your investigators or you are doing an activity. They know who you are, boom, they can immediately block you. So taking great care with how you acquire and manage your cryptocurrency is the second piece of advice to avoiding getting tripped up and exposed when investigating the dark web. Malware is also a way that can identify you, really anytime, not just on the dark web, but because these sites are already actively engaging in illegal activity, they're much more likely than other sites to be thinking about using malware as a way of unmasking their visitors. So as you visit the pages, they may well be trying to infect your computer with some sort of an application which will then be able to report back on who you really are, what your real network IP address is, any identifiers stored on your computer or indeed on your network. Even things like the names of printers on your network can be highly identifying. A similar attack is to use beaconed documents. So documents with some active content that when opened reports back on who opened them. So if you, for example, get a PDF from someone you're talking to on the dark web and then open it up on one of your investigation laptops or give it to another investigator to open, when they open it, that can then immediately beacon home and identify that computer and let them know exactly who you are, what organization you're with. And this is an attack that's been done actually fairly frequently. So you see, for example, people will intentionally leave documents lying around that they hope will get picked up that will beacon back. In fact, there's an entire category of attack called Canary Traps. And that's when marked information is allowed to disseminate. And then by looking at where it shows up, you know who's released it. So traditionally this would be done with, say, a marked document where the wording of each version of the document that's released is slightly different. In this case, if they give a document to an undercover person, someone they want to test, and then they notice law enforcement people snooping around after the URLs or the accounts that were in that document, they now immediately know that the person they gave that to is reporting back to law enforcement. And so you need to be very careful with all of the information you get, that it's not being used in a way that could potentially unmask you, or at least not used that way until you have all the information you need to close the net on them. Non-technical mistakes can also trip you up. Things like writing style. If you're communicating extensively online, and there's many samples of your real writing style available under your true identity, and you're writing a significant amount of material in your aliases, there are publicly available systems which will tie those together. We've even done tests ourselves using undercover identities and aliases that we've used in the past and checked to see, can we recognize them using modern author identification? And yes, we can, very successfully. It's kind of terrifying how easy and effective this kind of method is at unmasking you. So it's critically important to pay close attention to either limiting the amount of text you put out there in alias, making sure there are not writing samples of yours available publicly under your true name, or taking great pains to write in a substantially different style. Different sentence structures, different sentence lengths, different word choices. Even small patterns to do with what kind of conjunctions or adjectives or what kind of comma clauses you use in your sentence can expose you. Make sure you modify and adjust all of those when you're writing online. Interestingly, the rate at which these sites are getting exposed and uncovered has been increasing rapidly. So the risk of exposure really goes in both directions, both towards the users and towards the operators. And the net effect is most of the most popular online dark web marketplaces and souks have been shut down, and their lifespan is going shorter and shorter, and this is driving a change in behavior. Whereas just a couple of years ago, the dark web was a treasure trove of data for almost any investigator, we're now increasingly seeing the savvier operators instead going to one-on-one communications, using end-to-end encrypted person-to-person communication protocols rather than sort of open fora on the dark web. And so they're bypassing Tor entirely in many cases, and they're using applications like Signal or Telegram to try to have ephemeral communications only with one person, and then they're taking care of the non-attribution or misattribution of their communications separately from that application, and not necessarily relying on any centralized warehouse, which of course for law enforcement or any other investigator becomes this huge single point of interest, and so a huge amount of effort is taken to uncover those, whereas a number of individuals doing one-to-one communications, there's no single huge hoard of data for the investigator to claim. So the takeaway is, when you're investigating dark web websites, don't assume just because you're using Tor, you're going to be anonymous and going to be able to effectively pull off your undercover aliases or identities. There's a lot of ways you can still be uncovered and exposed as being law enforcement or an investigator of some sort, and that's going to undo a lot of your hard work. So make sure you're paying attention to these various ways you can be exposed and mitigate them to ensure the success of your operations. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Ntrepid Cast. I really appreciate you taking your time. We'd love to hear your feedback in the comments, so please leave those below. Let us know what you liked and what else you'd like us to be talking about. If you've enjoyed it also, please subscribe to the channel so you'll be automatically updated with new content as soon as it's posted. You can get these videos on our channel at YouTube, on our website, as well as getting audio versions of our podcasts for when you're in the car at the Ntrepidcorp.com website. So, until next time, ciao.